This will be a video response to the Adept Play seminar video, Kittybox. But there's some caveats that need to be put in place first. I'm only going to be presenting observations on the first 20 or 25 minutes of that video. That being the impressions of the Sandbox discussion, the clarification of what elements from those first impressions are going to be relevant in the first example, and the first example, that of the Secret of Bone Hill. That's all this video is going to apply to in terms of the Kittybox video. Additional observations are going to be brought in from the Phenomenology series and the further discussion between Ron Edwards and Vincent Baker on the right to dream. I think it's also appropriate at this point to clarify some terms I'm going to try and use in the video. I will be trying to resist the use of the word story for more than one meaning. Wish me luck. In this video, story is going to apply to any kind of outcome of play where there has been input from the players, including the game master, as the players, toward some kind of recognizable story goal, such as character arcs or Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, this sort of thing. Not limited to that Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 thing, but specifically where there has been some input by the players to direct the course of things or the interpretation of things to ensure that the outcome of play is recognized as story. That's how I'm going to try and use the word story, which leaves me kind of fumbling for a word to use when I'm not talking about that, when I'm talking about the emergent, another terrible word, when we're talking about simply play-producing experiences and outcomes. So awkwardly and in an unsatisfying way, I'm going to use the word tale for that. In other words, what we regale listeners with after play has concluded. So, let's begin. I'm only focusing on the beginning part of the video because I feel it's an excellent example of something that I've wanted to comment on for a while. This makes it so much easier to get those comments out and have them be interpreted the way that I would like them to be interpreted, as a contribution to the conversation, not as an attack or a criticism. That may seem to be an inciting remark, but what I'm getting at is that over the period of time that the Adept Play site has been more open, I have been noticing something that feels to me like a blind spot. Maybe I'm wrong, but the discussion between Edwards and Baker in particular about the right to dream kind of cemented this perception for me. And that blind spot, if it does indeed exist, informed a lot of what happened in the Kittybox seminar and kind of led the interpretation and the teasing and the memory even of the product, the Secrets of Bone Hill. It put it in a pattern that I'm not sure it actually belongs in, and almost gives us the perspective of interpreting what was written then from the standards of now, without getting all of the default assumptions of then in place because of the blind spot. So let's see what I'm talking about. The discussion began with impressions of what a sandbox is from the participants. So the two guest participants, let's say, were given an opportunity to explain what they thought a sandbox was, and then Ron Edwards, as the moderator, steps in and makes something out of those simple impressions so that the conversation can move forward. I thought he did that really well. Although, if he hadn't been present, the conversation would have gone in a completely different direction, would have talked about very different things, as some of what he brought in as the moderator weren't actually a part of their impressions. And the part that was, they were in direct conflict with each other. So I thought that was quite interesting. What did the two guests disagree about? Mainly it was time and story. What do I mean by that? Well, when Ron steps in, it's quite obvious from the way that he speaks, although I don't take this in a negative way, it's quite obvious that he prefers his own terms for things, and sandbox is not one of his terms. Now, I will refute, I'll add my own experience for what it's worth. Sandbox is much older than 10 years. I can benchmark it because I was using it before I came to Korea, which was more than 20 years ago. So I grew up role-playing in an area of relative geographic isolation, pre-internet culture, and the term sandbox was out there. It wasn't connected yet to the idea of video games such as Skyrim. It was used in specific reference to modules such as Keep on the Borderlands. And in our minds, it was connected directly to the sand table. See, I grew up among wargamers, and the sand table and the sandbox, there's a distinct connection there. It is an area that can be repurposed for anything. It is an area that has specific finite boundaries, primarily for the sanity of the individuals involved and to give them a place to stand. A place where they can look down upon the sand table in whatever form it's taking today, or look down into the sandbox in whatever it is displaying today, and be able to make some kind of coherent sense of it from the point of view of how you're going to be interacting with it as army pieces in a war game or as a character in a role-playing game. I feel like that connection is completely missing in this discussion, and I feel it is an important one. It lends to misinterpretations, or at least different interpretations, of even what is a dungeon. And we'll get to that later in the video. But the key things drawn out of the Kittybox discussion, for me, focus on either the presence or the absence of, in the discussion, of an understanding of the game master's role in the processing of time, consequences, and independent development of the setting. And these things comprise the sandbox. Now, when we listen to the impressions, one of them, and forgive me, I'm not able to remember in the moment who, talks about a map and plot elements being frozen in place until someone comes to interact with them. This is something that we can clearly see being part of the design process for video games, but does not have to be part of the process for a role-playing game. It certainly can be. Plot elements in place, frozen in time until interacted with. And this leads to a lot of the humor and jokes in this section about mercenary companies and whatnot, just waiting for you to interact with them, or bands of orcs just sitting in place, waiting to be killed, and the likes of this. I will just say that were I to have had this module in that time and read it, nobody would have been sitting around waiting for anything, because, as we are informed in the core rules of AD&D, without accurate records of time, you fill in the rest, you cannot have a meaningful campaign. What does that mean? That nothing is frozen and waiting. This is one of the default assumptions, right? So we have the sand table set up for a war game. We know what go is. We know that things have been happening prior to go, which result in that go state, that first second of combat. And we know that everything that happens after that is going to be in motion. Enemy tanks or cavalry or whatever are not going to be sitting there waiting to be encountered. they're going to be moving. And in a double blind game where the two players don't know what the other players are doing unless their units can actually see each other, this is further exemplified. So this default assumption seems to be completely missing from this point of view, and I feel it's important. And I feel it connects to the blind spot. So it's time to talk about the blind spot. The blind spot is in-character play. We go all the way back to the dawn of time for the role-playing hobby. We have a bunch of people who are looking to change up or add to or enhance the experience of putting yourself in the moment. Not some kind of, ethereal general hovering over a battlefield, but rather someone in the perspective of one character in the environment, free to make whatever choice made sense. Now, my memories of those times, and I'm a decade removed from the first days of play, my memory of those times is of the character merely being an avatar for the player's personality. It's what if I were there? A lot of people that I played with then played that way, but some of us took to play differently. It's what if I were someone who was there? In-character play. In-character play from the perspective of there being no, here comes the word, story. Meaning, no effort made by any of the players, including the game master, to influence the events, the order of events, the interpretation of events, or whatever, to create one. The focus was entirely on the decision-making process in the moment. Now, I mentioned earlier that sand tables and sandboxes are a concept designed for sanity. Right? Inside those borders, you are free to do whatever. But there have to be borders in order to allow the game master to do their job and to allow the players in the role of their characters to relate to the situation on a human scale. So, when we look at The Secrets of Bone Hill, we see that the module that Ron is using as his example is a sandbox. It has characters, it has places, it has information about the relationships between characters, the relationships between places, the relationship between the characters as the characters and the places as the places. What it doesn't have is the GM's role. It doesn't have a sense of time. It doesn't have story. It doesn't have any kind of plot. Therefore, it doesn't talk about consequences. And it does not provide you with development beyond its starting point, its go point. It is a sandbox. Take this and put it in motion. That's the default assumption. Why doesn't the writer, therefore, tell the reader that this is the default assumption? Why doesn't the writer inform the reader how to do that? Provide any guidance? There's a couple of reasons that, in my experience, make sense. One, page count. There's not enough pages for that sort of thing. Two, tradition. That's not how those things were written yet. And three, it was the default assumption of play. It didn't need to be said. And finally, four, it was in the core rule material for the game, in the Dungeon Master's Guide and in other player resources. We learn about the assumptions of play, still not very clearly or directly, but we do learn about managing time, managing consequences, and the independent development of the setting, regardless of where the characters are in relation to it. So, with that default understood, I think sandbox modules become a lot easier to use and easier to understand. Without it, of course, they're a tremendous problem. One of the easy stepping stones into that attitude is the in-character stance, where you're just showing up to experience the moment. You're not trying to be part of an epic story. You're not even trying to be part of a recognizable story. You're not expecting the GM to, in some way, work behind the scenes like a director or an author or anything like that. Instead, you're expecting the game master to be in the moment like you, interpreting events, keeping everything in motion. Once play starts within the confines of the sandbox, everything is in motion. That's the default assumption that I grew up with. So if we strip that away, we can wind up with an interesting take on the dungeon, and we can wind up with interesting designs for dungeons, which don't really mesh with the sandbox. So in the period of time where the sandbox develops as a mode of play, perhaps yet without a universal name that many gamers recognize, but as a way to present information about an area, the default mode of play was strongly focused on exploration. Move through the environment, meet people, learn things, make decisions, develop attachments, want things, go and get them, want to change things, go and try, etc. The dungeon, or the town, or the region, or whatever, the hex crawl, these things can be seen as a simple boundary inside which creativity and your management skills can flourish. Or it could be seen as a box, a restrictive control mechanism over choice. I'm in a dungeon hallway. I can't turn left and I can't turn right. I can only move forward toward something, or I can move backwards where I've already been. And that perspective on dungeons can lead us to thinking of them as linear, and can lead us to stripping away the component of time, focusing on, as a technique, the illusion of choice. And the illusion of choice means there's no actual choices. And without choices that matter, in-character play becomes impossible, and we're left with trying to move toward a story, or trying to overcome a series of challenges, or maybe just simply enjoying the camaraderie of the table. The dungeon is linear, and I'll put up an image in a minute, can mean a literal linear dungeon, such as one room connecting to one room, which is a map, which could be about exploration and could be entirely suited for the sandbox. Or it could be a series of encounters, one designed to follow the other, either in a completely open map where the game master is just moving encounters around to occupy different spaces upon it, or in an actual linear progression of room after room. The blind spot about in-character play, the missing of the default assumption about time, consequence, and independent development, pushes us toward that interpretation of the dungeon as linear, that interpretation of the dungeon as a series of encounters that will follow each other in sequence. It is a choice in a linear dungeon to choose to go no further, to go somewhere else, and be confident knowing that there will be somewhere else to go. So let's take a look at some images. This first image shows us two different diagrams of dungeon map. The one on the left, maybe your traditional dungeon map with a variety of rooms and a variety of ways to move through them. The second one is purely a diagram, not a map at all. The first one shows us a series of rooms and the ways to navigate them. The second shows us a series of encounters and the order in which they will happen. I don't know if you can read my handwriting. This was done off of a whiteboard. In the rooms style, This often assumes that there is some kind of timeline, and that there will be independent setting development, such as creatures or characters in another room have the potential to hear what you're up to and change what they're doing in response to it. A poor management of a dungeon has the player characters being the only ones moving around within it, while things just wait for them inside rooms. If you think to the description of the village of Restenford in the first part of this seminar, you'll see what I mean about that. Things don't just wait for you to go kill them. But in the encounter module, the one on the right, well, in a sense, they do. And the encounter module takes as a default the idea that there is the intention or the unconscious desire to participate in a story, to be a character moving through the progression of narration as you would find in fiction, which can happen in the room model, but does not have to. And so the order of encounters leads to story, whereas the order of progression through rooms does not have to. It leads to a tale of events that occurred one day in a dungeon. Let's talk about this. This is part of the rooms map. This is the in-out. This is whatever the entrance is. And it's important from the in-character perspective not to think of this as the way toward the story, the way toward the purpose of the session. It's important to think about it as what it is. Let's say a flight of stairs and some broken stone doors. It's a point of access to and egress from a location and nothing more. It is the possibility of potential enrichment or death. It is a decision to be made. Am I ready? I don't know. Do I have enough information? I hope so. Do I have enough people with me? Ugh, I can't afford any more. And that's it. It's not the start of a story in the sense that I implied earlier. It is simply a location, and it flows in at least two directions, in and out. This next notation on the map is of another staircase. This one marked with a L2. That's my notation for level 2. That's a staircase that goes to the second level of this complex. It comes down from it, it goes up to it. Things that are on that level can also use it for whatever purpose they might have, whenever it makes sense for them to do so. Likewise, this even messier notation takes us to level 3 of this complex, another flight of stairs or some other kind of method of changing level, takes us to the third level of the complex, and the beings or creatures or elements that are also in this complex can make use of this and will make use of this to move around for their own needs, whether that be biological or for some other purpose. When you take into consideration that many models of dungeon design include the idea that the beings that are there on each level increase in capability from the first level through the second level. In fact, the idea of levels maps to this quite well. When you take that into consideration, the decision or the ability to make a decision about which level you're going to assail next is an incredibly empowering one. Your ability to enter and exit the area when you feel it is necessary, and the possibility that whatever is inside that area will also be moving with impunity, regardless of whether or not that would make a good story, is a key part of play. Your use of time, your use of your resources, your desire when to gamble, when not to gamble, your ability to collect information based on the relationships that you are encouraging or forging over time as you move through this sandbox environment are the things which enable you to conduct your own capacity to adventure and explore in this fictional world. It really has nothing to do with you being a protagonist in a story. The dotted lines on the map are, of course, secret passages, ways to move more freely through the map if you have the skill or some resource which allows you to use them, such as if you are a denizen of this place, or if you have taken the time to research other forays into this place or the records of it from the lost dim recesses of memory. It's very likely that all the different secret locations and secret passages and tunnels and doorways on the map, it's very likely they will remain unknown to the players. This is a part of in-character play, knowing that as you move through the sandbox, there were things that you missed, things that would have completely changed the tapestry of your life. But as there is no story, this is color. This is not a mistake. This is not a waste of time. This is not pixel bitching, or whatever else you would like to call it. This is just opportunity. This is a location as the location, with the location being free to be that location and relate to its environs as it should if it were real. This is the same for characters as it is for places, for organizations, for relationships between characters and places and organizations, and on and on. The thing is allowed to be the thing and exist in the moment, to be operated by the game master or by the player in the moment as the thing itself, regardless of any other consideration. So, with all of that in mind, let's go back to the Restenford description shared with us by Ron. And he's looking at it through, the light of memory, and he's laughing at it, and he's laughing at his memories of how he reacted to it as a child, I guess, and as later on when he came to it with his current eyes, trying to use it for play in more recent times. But let's look at the thing as the thing. Restenford is meant to be a safe harbor and/or base of operations for a party. This does not mean that adventure there is impossible, far from it. However, as DM, you should try to make this purpose clear without having to blurt it out in as many words. The details of the castle and abbey are given, but the exact information therein and the map of the castle are not likely to be necessary until Module L2. The garrison is provided to maintain some degree of order through the town. As you will note, the town is mostly chaotic neutral in nature. Chaotic neutral does not equate with brawling, meleeing, spells in the streets, and open mayhem. Be sure you are clear on the meaning of this alignment and that your players understand it as well. In many of the locations in town, there will be a chance to pick up information. Thus, you will have to know what the non-player characters know about the town itself, and so on and so forth. At the part that Ron shared, taken out of context, and taken with the idea that this default assumption I've been describing is unknown to the reader, that's problematic. But the hint lies in the next section. You're not going to need this part until the module, which contains the pre-written adventures. The garrison does this. Why is that garrison description there? Because the town is in motion. The default assumption is there. Right? Notes for the DM on the page before. Altogether, there are 315 occupants of the town, most of which are human. Virtually every able-bodied adult male or boy over 13 is enrolled in the militia. People not in the militia, including young children, have poor morale and will seldom fight even if backed into a corner. Any such individual, if he or she does overcome initial fright, will grab any weapon at hand and fight in the following way. Are we assuming that the player characters are riding roughshod, attacking the 315 occupants of the town, or are we assuming that this is a dangerous place which has an awful lot of stuff going on independent of the activities of the player characters? When the player characters are away, bad stuff happens. When the player characters are there, bad stuff happens. But the town itself is not inherently
dangerous. It's much safer than the surrounding environment. It's much safer than the surrounding environment. And discovery of that fact is an obvious conclusion from exploration, which is how you explain it to the party without having to blurt it out. You show, you don't tell, because it's not a story. Restonford will be as safe as they allow it to be, safe as they make it, and compared to what's around it is definitely much safer than their adventuring life will be. And so, that in-character play, they come into the town after their dungeoneering or their overland adventuring, beaten up, terrified, and wondering if they're going to survive. They come into town, and most of the people there don't want to fight. The able-bodied people are enrolled in the militia and have some sort of control in their lives. Most of the people there are chaotic neutral and are leaving people alone. Most of the people there know that there's really bad stuff outside of town, and they would rather not have it be inside of town, and so on and so forth. But once play starts, life in Restiford is moving forward. What if the player characters decide, this place is all right, let's actually live here and use it as a base of operations? And they go off, they raid places, they come back with loot, and people notice that their fortunes are on the rise. What will happen? Won't they become another part of the rumor mill? Won't their full purses attract the attention of thieves and other bandits? Won't their successes breed jealousy and rivalries? Things will change. And as we discover in the later modules in the series, there are things nearby the town which in the future might be uncovered because of dramatic events you could choose or not choose to put into motion. So, the questions raised partly in jest but partly seriously in this part of the debate are answered by reading the full text and by looking at it with the eyes of the time period in which it was written. Or at least, that's how I feel.
We could see Restonford as a series of encounters just waiting for the player characters to move into proximity, and then they will activate. We could see the Secrets of Bone Hill as the incomplete, unfinished, and basically unplayable setup for what might come later. Things that say, hands off, you can't touch this until you buy L2. Or we could see it as a sandbox. We could see it as someone doing the groundwork for you, but still expecting that you, as the game master, will step in, read this material, own it, and therefore take charge of controlling the passage of time, administering consequences for good or ill, and understanding that once in motion, these objects will stay in motion, that your character is the world, and the world is as alive as the player characters within it. This is the sandbox. This is the sand table. Everything is in motion until we say it is not. It's not a series of planned encounters. It's not this linked set of boxes of this follows that. It is instead a chaotic mess of possibility from which character action and then retrospection might lend a sense of order. But the thrill is not in the moving through arcs or moving into the epic nature of story, but instead someone's life. It seems like no discussion of Sandbox can escape the counter discussion of Railroad. I'm not a fan of talking about these two things together. I see them as being quite different. One being a decision for how to run your game, the other being a method of design for your game world. One of them occurs well before play. The other might occur in the moment. Now, yes, it might be the decision to run an adventure module and run it exactly as written, and run it exactly as written with full intention to strip the players of choice. But that's an awful lot of caveats to attach to this. Railroading. Is the dungeon a railroad? Is it? Did you run it like one? Is the dungeon a railroad? Is it? Is there only one story outcome possible? If you're not playing with story in mind, can you have a railroad? These are interesting questions, I think. Now, I would recommend anybody who's watching this who hasn't watched the full video to do so and to take a look at adeptplay.com. There's a lot of interesting things going on there. It's a place about ideas, talking about how we do what we do. What is it that we do when we do what we do? And I appreciate it a lot. As I said at the beginning, this video is not meant as an attack on what was said. It was meant to serve as an example of how the missing pieces in our perception of things can matter a lot to someone else, and how they might be an important part of the whole that is informing, biasing, prejudicing, pushing our understanding out of alignment with what is actually going on. We don't all play the same way. We don't all read the same things the same way. We all come from different standpoints, and so do the authors who write what we read. So, I hope this video has had some use. I hope it is taken as it was intended, and I look forward to feedback from it. Take care.